So if you guys are out there in the cold, really cold, snowy day, and you're pulling on that pull cord on your snowblower, and you're throwing levers up and down, maybe the choke is on, maybe it's not, the RPM is maybe up all the way, you're priming, nothing's happening. All right, maybe a little bit of fuel's leaking out, not sure what's going on, you're starting to panic, you want to get all this done, it's snow everywhere, it's lousy out, you're cold, the machine is cold. I feel you, okay? So in this episode, we're going to get to that. We're going to cover that, why it may be really hard to start, what you may or may not be doing correctly, what you might be doing wrong, or what maybe you're just not doing and you don't understand. So we're going to cover all of that in this episode, and hopefully we can get you going on those really cold days, because it's nothing like starting any machine in the summertime or on a nice day and you think, hey, this is going to be great. We're going to get this thing going. And I'm going to be able to take on the snow this year. Good luck with that. Now, before we get into the video clip I've got for us on what to do, let's talk a little bit about what machines I have here, something that just happened yesterday. We had a big snowstorm, and let's take a look at the machines that I just did for a customer who had problems yesterday trying to get these machines going in this really nasty cold weather. It's kind of rainy, snowy kind of a day. It was definitely a nor'easter. But it was a weird one. It was very warm at first, and then it got very wet, and it snowed, it rained, it snowed. He's out there trying to snowblow. You got slushy, wet snow, and it's cold, and it's getting colder as the day goes on. And, of course, he's having nothing but problems getting these things running. Now, I went over this with him when he took delivery, but let's just take our first look at these machines when he dropped them off. So there's two of them, a yard machine and a Murray, and here's the little yard machine. This thing, the starter motor burned out. Somebody fried it. But I went over both machines, and this is the bigger Murray. This thing's pretty big, like 27 inches or something. Very similar to the one that I have. Basically the same thing. Almost identical. They're around 8 to 10 horsepower. These are nice older machines, and I got them running really good. And when I go over a machine, I go over everything on a machine. I mean, I don't leave anything. And I gave him a really good price, too, because I'd like to get his business. Went over everything, and they just were acting up on him. Now, when he finally got, I think it was the bigger one running, he ran over a hose or something and got it all jammed in there and wrapped up real tight. Somebody did. And then he turned to this little guy, and he couldn't get it running. Now, this one has a little bit more of a problem to get started. He did try to ether, and then he describes fuel coming out of the carburetor, and then he describes it coming out of the spring thing on the bottom, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit. So it's helpful to understand the mechanics of what's going on. It's the physics and the mechanics, and even a little bit of the chemistry of what's actually happening. Now, here's a shot of the engine on the smaller machine. They're both basically the same engines. All right, so Tecumseh, about, like I said, between 8 and 11 horsepower. There's really no difference. And you can see the carburetor here. The muffler is off. And so the carburetor is mounted to this intake tube, which is an intake manifold. And notice the carburetor is actually lower than the gas tank, which is actually good for fuel supply. It's a little bit lower. So you can maintain good fuel as long as you have about full tank or half a tank. I've even gotten them down to, they'll run with about 10 or 20 ounces of fuel, just sloshing around in the bottom. And as long as the hose is in good shape, the supply hose and all of that is working good, this should run. But what is it that goes wrong? Well, I want you to make note of the length. See the carburetor on the right, but it's bolted to an intake runner, which then is pretty big. It's made out of aluminum, and it goes upwards, and it then bolts into the engine itself. It doesn't bolt into the head. It bolts into the engine block, because on this particular engine, it's what we call a flathead. So the valves are actually in the engine. They're not sitting on top as part of the head or an overhead valve assembly. So just make note of that right now as we get into this next segment. So in this example here, we're talking about a flathead engine. And you might be thinking, well, I don't have a flathead engine. All right. So what I want to talk about in this segment is that it doesn't matter. Yes, this is a little bit more pertinent to the flathead, and that will bring up certain specific issues with regard to the flathead. But the situation is basically the same. Why? Why is that? Well, first of all, I live here on Long Island, right? So we're a couple of feet above sea level where I am. And normally we would have the most amount of air pressure and air available, oxygen, out of anywhere else that's, might be in the United States or Canada, whatever. If you're in elevation, if you're like me and you happen to be at sea level or just a little bit above, you have a lot of air to work with, a lot of oxygen. However, that changes when a storm comes in because the pressure drops. And when the barometric pressure drops, and if you happen to be at that point in the storm where that barometric pressure is very low, no one has any real appreciable amount of oxygen really available. I mean, there's enough for certain to run the machine and for us to breathe, but it's a lot less. And that starts to change the fuel mixture. Now, the other thing that changes the fuel mixture is, quite frankly, it's the cold. It's the engine is cold. The whole everybody's cold. Everything is cold. The fuel is cold. We're cold. We're getting cranky. We want to get this done. I think for him, he even admitted that he got a little impatient, and I could see that. And right away, it's the mechanic. The mechanic didn't do it right, or it's not working right. All right. Let's set that aside. So that carburetor, the fuel in the gas tank, everything is cold. And, dense air, cold air is, for hot rodders and engine builders is a wonderful thing. But I never saw any hot rodders or race cars drag racing and racing around tracks in freezing cold, rainy, snowy, storm, low barometric pressure days. So the heck with that. All right. The reality is it's cold, and it doesn't want to atomize when it's cold. It goes to vapor pressure. All fuels have a certain vapor pressure, and gasoline, being one of them, is very volatile. Its volatility comes from the fact that in warmer weather, it becomes volatile. The gases, the hydrocarbons that are more free, they are very volatile, and they want to off-gas. They want to evaporate very quickly when it's warm, when the fuel is warm, when the engine's warm, when the intake tube is warm, or whatever I call that thing, right? You can call it whatever you want. Intake tube, intake manifold, doesn't matter. Even if the carburetor, like on overhead valves, the carburetor is mounted much, much closer to the valve itself, which is on top of the engine block. So overhead valve, the valve assembly, all of that, the carburetor that bolts to it, the muffler, that's all very close. It doesn't have as far to go. But when everything is cold, it doesn't matter. So that fuel does not want to vaporize. It comes into the engine in the form of droplets. And droplets, number one, don't like to be compressed. So if you flood the engine, you could hydrolock it. Anything that's a liquid, you cannot compress it. You have to vaporize it, and then you can compress it. An engine's an air compressor. It's a compressor of a kind. So you got to get that fuel warm, and you can't. It's freezing out. So what do? Well, that's what the primer and the choke is for. And this is where people start to lose their focus on what's actually going on in the engine. If you overprime, well, what does priming do? Well, in this case, it takes a puff of air, and when you press it, it sucks the air in from the back, fills the bulb, and when you press the primer, the tube runs down into the carburetor, and it blows through a port into the bowl, on top of the bowl, and disrupts the fuel that's laying there. And that fuel will jump up, and hopefully it goes into the throat of the carburetor. From there, when you go to pull or press the starter button, that gets sucked in. So that's like raw fuel. Now, on top of that, most people they turn the choke on. And I'll find you a shot somewhere in this, either here or a little bit later, of the choke blade when it shuts. And a lot of people get confused as to which way the choke is on. Well, when it's on, in this case, you turn it all the way to the right, the choke flapper is closed. And so it's restricting the amount of air coming in to the engine. You might be saying, well, Arch, you're saying shouldn't it need more air? I know, this is where people get confused. Yeah, because the air pressure is dropped, yada, 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 right? You would think it would need more air. No. The bigger problem is that the fuel is so cold, it will not atomize. Its vapor pressure is much lower. It's not off-gassing. It's not as volatile. Those vapors are not going into the engine. And the spark plug does not light raw fuel. It lights the vapor, the fuel vapor, in the presence of the air that's been drawn into the combustion chamber. So there's probably enough air. That's not the issue. The issue is the damn fuel will not light. And it's coming in very wet. And when that happens, you start to need a lot more fuel than almost anything else just to get it up that tube and into the engine in the presence of the piston spinning, going up and down and the motor turning over, and trying to compress that and slightly warm that mixture up a little bit, get it dispersed, and at some point the plug will have something to light off and burn, and then the motor will start to kick. So that's essentially what's going on. So take a moment out, maybe pause this video and think about what I'm saying, is you need to get more fuel up there. And because of that longer tube, well, it's got a long way to travel. And of course, it's got to go up. And if it's really cold out, it can't maintain its vapor pressure. So what happens is it falls out. So when you take like an atomizer, a spray bottle, and you spray it, what you notice is that some of it comes out real fine, but a lot of it starts to drip out of the nozzle. The heavier particles fall to the ground first, just like a sneeze. So it's trying to travel up, and a lot of it is actually falling down. And it's going to accumulate down at that turn where the carburetor is. It's going to sit there. And you start to get, instead of getting a lean condition where the engine is starving for fuel, you start to get sort of this wet, rich condition temporarily laying there in the bottom of the carburetor. And one of the things that he noticed is it looked like fuel was dripping out of that little spring thing. Let's go take a look at that. Hold on, let me set that up. So it's helpful to understand what's actually happening, because otherwise this is all just going to be voodoo and magic. Because you're going to be moving levers around and not really understand what's going on. And then you'll move something one way and you're not going to get a result. You're going to move it the other way. You're not going to get a result. And you're not going to know why. You're going to be priming and flooding, or not priming enough, or not choking enough. And you're not going to know why. So in this next segment here, I want to show you a few things. Now, this is a brand new replacement carburetor. And as you can see, right, it's got an adjuster right here. And it's also got an adjuster over here. Now, these are really nice. A lot of times I get this as a HIPA carburetor, so shout out to them. I like these, okay, because these you can adjust to any environment. And if you know what you're doing and that storm is really bearing down and it's really low pressure, we can tweak this and get the engine running really sweet. Now, what it doesn't have is this, okay? And this is this little thing here. He was talking about this little spring thing. And we're going to take a look right here in this segment, and I'll show you. So there it is on the carburetor. That this is actually for the bigger machine. So this is a slightly different carb, and only because it has slightly different features on it. But they're really the same. There is really no difference. That little thing there is a valve. You press on that. Let me let it run. I'm actually testing the float bowl right here. So that's the little valve on the float bowl, and it allows you to press that and purge some of the fuel from the bottom of the bowl in case there's some dirt or water. And you can see the size of these float bowls. They're pretty big, right? So that's usually filled about halfway with gas. And the reason for that is there is a float inside of it. Let me show you a float. I'm actually pressing on it. I just pressed on that little thing right there. But there's no adjustable jet on this one. Let me show you what's inside real quick so that we have a good understanding. So in this instance here, this is what the carb looks like when it's dirty, as I'm beginning to clean it. I haven't really cleaned it yet. So you can see there's the float, okay, and that's going to close as it lets fuel into the float bowl. It will rise up and shut the little valve that's attached to it, and it'll stop more fuel from coming into the bowl. You let this segment run a little bit. And I'm about to clean it, so I'm just laying it there and showing and setting up for the shot. And there's the jet, right? That's a fixed jet. The one that I showed you on the other carburetor is an adjustable jet, and it's a little dirty. And I'm going to just kind of start cleaning it. But what's important to understand is the size of the bowl itself. And there's the float. Okay, and the pin. Yeah, let me see. We'll take it off together. All right. There we go. See? And there's the needle. There's the little rod that it rolls on. Okay. Sort of levers on. And right there is the little needle. And that's what we're working with. And that allows, if it's adjusted right, that allows that float bowl, that little aluminum or steel bowl right here, right, to fill up about halfway. It's dirty, as we can see. All right, let me come back. So just a little quick education for some of you may not know all of this stuff, and that's understandable, and that's what this video is for. So as this little float bowl begins to fill up about halfway, and then that valve shuts it off, and now it's ready to run the engine, and it will, as it drops, that valve system will open up. It'll let more fuel in, trying to keep it consistent. And there's a couple of things that I noticed from what he said. Now, he was priming, and he says it's leaking from here, okay? Well, if you press it, it's going to leak because it's a purge. If you have one of these, that's a purge, as I said, to get out any dirt or potential water, and it's a good thing to do. It's also good to check to see that let's say you put fuel in your fuel tank, and how do you know you have any fuel over here by the carburetor? It could be a clog. The mechanisms in here could be screwed up. It could be dirt plugging it. Well, if you have one of these and you press on it and let it run out for a little bit, run it into a small glass or something so you could check the state of it. You'll see if there's water or if it doesn't look right or if dirt came out. It's a good thing to have. Not all carburetors have this. He had one and he says it's leaking from there. We need to replace it. We need a new carburetor. I went through all of this. It didn't need to be replaced. What was happening was he was priming it so much. So when you prime, there's this one doesn't have a primer port, but the air is blown into the carburetor, into the bowl, and this is the intake of the choke side. And so what was actually happening, he was priming it so much, the fuel was spilling out of the bowl and up into here. And that was causing it to drip out and then run down the carburetor, and it looked like it was coming from there. But he overprimed it. So there was a lot of raw fuel sitting in the throat of the carburetor. And here's your choke. See, that's closed. That's about a quarter, and that's open. So this one has, let's see, 1, 2, it has 2 positions. Actually, 1, 2, 3. So it has full open, no choke. Partial choke, which is like I call that quarter or half, and it depends on how many positions it has, and then that's full choke. So in this case, right, you could try starting it halfway or running it halfway. I'm going to get into that in this coming segment where I actually run it. And of course, this is the throttle end. See, that's not the choke. That's the throttle end. So when you lift up on that rod or the throttle rod, it does this. And it will try to, with the governor, it'll try to maintain a position that's suitable for the job. So the RPM, the top RPM of the engine. But just remember, that's the choke. So by disrupting that fuel in the fuel bowl, it was coming up and laying over here. And it's supposed to do that. But if you keep doing it, and the engine's not really starting, and you don't have the choke set right, so if you've got too much choke, it may not run at all. You have to try backing it off. And what he was seeing, it was actually pouring out. Now, that's because it was coming this way. But it can go this way as well, depending upon if the machine is tilted. And it can come this way and lay in the bottom of that riser tube, particularly on this model engine. In an overhead valve, it can also lay behind the valve. And then when you go to spin the motor over, all that collected fuel will suddenly dump into the engine, and it won't burn. You can't burn that. It will not light. So you flooded it. In his case, going up that tube, going this way, it was probably laying here. Then maybe he moved the machine and the carburetor got tilted and he saw it come out. What I usually do with these machines is I grab the handles and I lay the machine down on its handles. And if I see fuel coming out, then I know it's flooded. And I lay it down there for a little bit, let it drain out. The float should stop the fuel from completely emptying out. It should, depending upon how far you lay it. You don't have to lay it all the way. And if it doesn't, it'll just keep peeing out. But generally speaking, with these, I've noticed that I'm able to just drop it on its handlebars for a few minutes if it's been flooded that way. And if you see a lot of fuel coming out, you flooded it. You flooded it big time. And you may have to pull the plug out and dry that plug off and put it back in again because you've wet the plug down. It won't fire. Now it won't spark. And you may even want to take the plug out and pull the engine over a bunch of times because if you've got that much wet, raw fuel in your engine, you'll hydrolock it. Imagine emptying this bowl full of gas and take the plug out and dumping it right in. You'll hydrolock. You'll wet the plug. It'll never fire. You're going to have to keep pulling that engine over until you get all that stuff out of there and dry it out. Imagine that. Well, if you keep priming it and choking it and pulling it over, it will try to suck all of that in and up, or in the case of an overhead valve, it doesn't have very far to go. It'll wind up inside the engine in the combustion chamber. You'll be totally flooded out. You're going to be yelling at everybody. You're going to be yelling at your neighbor, your lady, your guy, the mechanic. That's probably what was happening. All right, let's go to the segment where we run this thing. I have another machine out front. It's out in the cold. It's really cold today. It's bright, sunny, very windy, but it's also very cold. And this is the day after the storm. So let's get to that. All right, so choke is all the way to the right. That's full. That's about midway. That's about quarter, and that's off. I know you can't see it roll that well because of the glare, but all right, so we're going to go to all the way, and we're going to bring this up all the way to the top. That's your throttle, and then your primer. Okay, about 3 or 4 times. Now, if you see gas come out from underneath here, all right, see that? That's a little tickler. That's a bowl drain, and I'll show that again in another picture, another segment of this. But that way you know gas is coming out of here, and there's gas in the tank. Check that. That's just a good drain to get rid of anything that might be in the bottom, of debris. And if you prime it a lot, it'll look like gas comes out of here, but it's not. It's coming out of the front. All right, it's been out here. It's cold. All right, it's cold. I walked away to check the video segment here, that I made sure that last segment was okay. So we're going to prime it. We're going to leave everything the way it was. I'm going to prime it 2 more times and give it a pull. Now, what's important to understand is if it runs rough and wants to stall, you're probably going to see a lot of blue smoke or just smoke in general coming out. That's okay. If it starts and runs, but it wants to stall, I may want to move the choke to about halfway. Okay, take a little choke off, leaving the RPMs up. If it feels like it's cleaning up and running better, I'm going to let it run on that for a little bit. And if it's still kind of smoking, we're going to pull the choke off a little bit more. If at any point it wants to stall as I take the choke off, well, then that means it's not ready yet. It's not warm enough yet. It's not getting enough extra fuel, which is what the choke is to help out with, right? And we'll explain that in the shop later. So let's start with full choke and just watch what I'm doing. Let me move the camera a little bit so you can see the movement on the choke butterfly. So you can see it started right up, no problem. I ran it on midway choke for a little bit, but you could still hear it's not run. It wasn't running quite right, but it wasn't looking to stall. Then I went to about quarter choke and I let it run. I dropped the RPMs down a little bit. I don't leave the RPMs on high because it's cold and it's a slap oiler. In other words, there's no oil pump. So we don't want that oil to not be where we need it to be while it's cranking away at full RPM. So that's why I like to, when I feel comfortable, I bring that RPM down and let it warm up with the RPMs a little bit lower. That's the idea of that. And then when it's warm, choke fully off. If it likes that, it's ready to go. We try out auger and a few other things, make sure she's not going to stall. If she's not going to stall, she's ready to go. Sometimes what I'll have to do if it's really cold and lousy, I'll leave a little choke on for a little bit. And that'll help it, you know, kind of keep going so I can start working. But don't forget, if you start to see black smoke, whatever coming out, you've left your choke on. And it won't run right. You got to listen for the sounds that it's supposed to make. Take your time. I'll see you guys in the shop in a minute. Okay, so you can use some thrust. This is thrust starting fluid. It's for gas and diesel engines. It says a quick start in extreme cold conditions, effective to negative 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, a bunch of different companies make this. There's also one where you got to read it a little bit more, but this one is for like deep cold. I also had one that says it has oil in it. So they make a few different variations of this. It really doesn't matter. If you're going to be using it a lot, that's a different story. Now, when you go to use this, here's what I would recommend. So let's say everything is good and you just can't get it started. Before you really do anything, keep in mind that there's an air box on the front of these carburetors, okay? An air box. By the way, this one's really beat. So let's say, you know, your engine was running good and everything and you're just having a hard time. Hopefully, you know, your engine didn't, or your carburetor didn't turn to crap from all the alcohol in the gas, which causes other issues, including hard start issues. That alcohol is also a problem in terms of when it's really cold. It's not going to vapor off. So that air box is in your way, and you're going to have to kind of spray down a little bit, under a little bit. Like if you spray this way, it may not come out of the can. But, you know, certainly down around the seam. You got to get it up underneath there. So liberally, you're not going to hurt the engine. And then pull the engine over. If it kicks and wants to run a little bit, great. Okay, you got to have the choke open a little bit too, because you can't completely close the choke. Because if you completely close the choke when you go to spray this, how's this going to get in there? All right, it's going to be so restricted, it's really not going to get in there. So if you can kind of lay it up underneath that air box. If it's a newer machine, you may have a closed air box. There's usually no filters or anything, but it may be more of a closed air box. You may have to take that apart a little bit so that you can kind of get into the carburetor and then spray a bunch in. Another way to do it is if it's flooded. Now it's flooded. This is not going to help if you've really flooded it. However, if you take the plug out and pull the engine over and spray a little bit of this in and spray it on your plug, and pull everything over, take the plug off of the engine and spray it. And because this will evaporate quicker, don't use gum out or anything like that. This will evaporate. Gum out will sit and stay, and then it'll just be flooded with gum out now. This will evaporate. But if it's really cold, everything's going to evaporate a lot slower. Now, yesterday, I was out on the tractor. That's not a good day to be doing this, right? To really be doing this, because it was a wet snow. And as it was hitting the tractor seat, it was melting and it was getting wet. As it was hitting the steering wheel, it was getting wet. Imagine you're trying to pull a plug out. Now that's getting wet. Potential crap of water and wet snow going down into the plug hole. So this may help. Try this first, because if the engine kicks and it's trying to run, but then it just doesn't stay running, now it's more of a fuel issue. And you got to get that cold fuel and that cold engine to somehow go through there and keep it running long enough without flooding it. Now, as I mentioned earlier about the RPMs and the slap oiling, with the engines that I go over, I set I set the lowest RPM anywhere between 2,000 and 2,400. Now, typically, that's pretty high. That's a lower RPM. That's where I like to run them in to get them warm once it's started, as I mentioned in that segment. You should have no problem oiling it if that's where your RPM is, and that's where I set them. I know there's a slap oiler and everything, but that's pretty high RPM. There are some carburetors and some of the older ones that I've seen where you can get some of these engines down to a very low RPM. And if you don't have a pressurized oiling system with a filter, yeah, that could be a problem. You could kill your motor. But you want to keep it running. And so let's say you get the thing running and everything, and it is cold out, maybe even a little wet, and you need to walk away for some reason. Don't shut it off. Drop the RPM down till before it shuts off. If you know you have a good RPM, you can go get a tachometer or ask your mechanic. And if it's running at that RPM around 2,000 to 2,400, you should be fine. Okay, it'll keep it warm. It'll keep it going for you to be ready to go. And maybe when you first get it running, like I said, drop it down that RPM. Go get yourself together, put your gloves on, whatever else you got to do, and get ready. Go do something else. Come back 5 minutes later and let the machine be warm. Now, there's some old stories and stuff, and I watch a lot of like Will It Runs. There are guys with diesel tractors, and they got to bring them out in the snow or even some of the skid steers, but more of the diesel tractors. Some of them are a single cylinder, 3-cylinder, 4-cylinder, whatever, even the bigger ones, even some of the big earth movers, they don't want to run when it's really cold out, regardless of snow or not. And I've seen all manner of tricks. I've seen people just thrust right in until it finally really starts to run, and even during a little bit. I've seen it where they've taken torches and heated up the intake manifold and get that going good. I've seen it where they've even tried to heat the oil pan. They put block heaters in. They leave it connected. For these little machines, we have none of that. I've even seen some of the old stories of where, like in the high north, with some of these big old earth movers, they never shut them off. Well, that's great. You got like continuous fuel. Or they would light fires underneath the engine and for a time get it warm. That's the stuff you hear from like Siberia and everything. And a lot of the older machines had pony motors on them. They were gas-driven motors that the oiling system and the coolant system was connected to a small single-cylinder gas motor. And you still had to get that gas motor to fire off, but even the trouble that may have given you to get started was nothing like trying to get a diesel started. Of course, now you got block heaters and glow plugs and all manner of things. But even still, on a really cold day, and the things that have been sitting, this is a problem. Well, if you're old like me, okay, you might remember back before electronic fuel injection. Computer-controlled electronic fuel injection. All right, all these cars today, it handles all this for you. And because back with the cars back then, these were either automatic chokes, which were like choke stoves with a spring that heated up, and they were mechanism-style chokes, or they were manual choke. And a lot of these engines for these cars, when it was really cold out and you had a snowstorm in particular, they didn't want to run, and they needed to be run on half choke for a little bit. Sometimes those old chokes weren't adjusted over time. There's a lot of problems with that, and many of us remember what it was like fighting with a choke or fighting with an engine that just didn't want to warm up. It takes a long time for a big motor to warm up. Now, some of those you can get them started for a couple of reasons, those older engines. One reason is you've got more cylinders, okay? So one of those cylinders is going to get lucky, and it's going to start to fire off, and maybe two will get lucky. And if you have 4 cylinders or 8 cylinders or 6 cylinders, eventually, once it's running, but it may not have any power, but you'll get it started. Now, in this situation here, another thing to consider, when the oil is cold as well. And when the oil is really cold, it's not going to help seal the rings. It's going to be thick and viscous. And the steel and the aluminum and all that, the engine components are going to be cold, like I said earlier, but they're not going to want to move. And they're not going to move freely. And they're not going to seal as well, like for the combustion gases and all that. So as you're pulling it over, you need a certain RPM, revolutions per minute, to really kind of whip up the engine, to really kind of get the pressures up and get the fuel and air mixture going and the liquid splashing around. You need a certain amount of that. You see this on some of the firing up of some of these old engines that have been sitting around. A couple of cylinders here and there might fire off, and then little by little she comes back to life. Of course, this motor is, I think I measured it like 150 PSI. So the one I just did, the two for him, yes, they're getting older, but where we live, it doesn't always snow. So these are older engines. Yours might be an older engine, even if it's an overhead valve. It may not have been used that much. There could be some rust or oxidation or whatever. And also, it's just not used all that often. So even if you're like a contractor person and you don't do most of your work in the freezing cold with snow, with machines with engines on them. You don't. You're doing it, might be cold out in the spring or fall, might be a two-stroker or something, might be a lawnmower, but most of your work is done regularly with this equipment, and it's warm out or hot out. Not a machine that gets used a couple of times a year, put away, and that's another discussion for another episode, but I'll say this, put away and left. And then you take it out and it's that really cold, lousy day. And now you're expecting it to perform. So what are my suggestions? Let me get you out of here on this. Now, the first thing is don't do that. Okay. I guess somewhere in the fall on a nice day or weekend, you have a day off, whenever that is, go out there, get the thing, out of the shed or whatever, check it over, put gas in it, hit the tickler. If you have one, little French tickler thing, and purge the gas and see if you can get the engine running. If you can get it running, right? Let it run, let it warm up. Now you know it's running. Remember, I went over all these machines and I went over his machines. They were mint. And I'll show you them here. They were mint. I went over everything. So there's nothing wrong with it. He was like, oh, we need a new carburetor. No, he's guessing. He's got the part shotgun out and firing at the mechanic and everything else. No, that's not the case because I went over everything. He just recently took delivery on it. Nothing is wrong with the machine. It's user error. Either the machines are not put away well, which is a separate issue. You want to stabilize your gas. You want to make sure there's no dirt or oil. And the other possibility, and I often say this, now I don't think it's his issue, but I've seen this with customers. They put dirty gas in their equipment. They leave the gas can out, whatever kind of gas can it is, and water and dirt gets in it. And they go, well, I just put fresh fuel in. Yes, you did. But the little bit of junk that was at the bottom had junk in it and had water in it. You went to the gas station. You put 93, whatever, or 87 piss water in there. And it wound up in the tank of the machine, ran down, right, because it will settle, is sitting in the bottom of the float bowl. And you're trying to suck up dirt and water, and that won't burn. That is very common. I have done many a machine where it has come back immediately. And when I start sucking that out, that's what I find. So try to avoid that. Come up with plans and watch videos like mine and others where they talk about how to avoid that and how to diagnose that. Getting back to bringing it out on a nice day before the winter really settles in, and make sure everything you've got is good shape and running good. Of course, at the end of the year, learn to put it away properly. This way, you know it's running before that really nasty day. If you know it's running before that nasty day, forget about this is no good and that is no good, because it just ran fine. It's usually now the user error in that panic. And as I said, we generally don't run our machines on these really lousy days. Who the hell wants to be out there? So that's adding to the panic of it. And lastly is slow down, right? Slow down, take a breath, try to understand what's happening, be observant. Don't be impatient. And try not to listen to everybody else that's yelling in your ear or a neighbor comes by. Try to think it through and maybe do a little research or watch a video like this, and you'll have a better understanding of what's actually going on. And I'll get you out on this last comment. One of the fellas was, I guess, watching a video I had over the summer on a 3.5 horsepower Briggs engine. And I was kind of going over the setup and cleaning it and talking about the problems that occur with these old engines. And then, of course, I discussed how to tune it and certainly set up the RPMs for the max RPM, what I recommended, what the book recommends, how it works with the governor, all of that, right? And I'm literally like right in close. He writes me, he goes, what's the max RPM? How do I set it up? How do I do this? And I'm like, I went over a little bit of it with him, and I pointed him back to the video because he didn't watch that part of the video. He was impatient. And so he had to wait for me to maybe, because I wasn't going to answer him. I usually don't answer people that ask me questions that are already addressed in my videos. If I take the time to address the problem in a video and that answer is there and you don't take the time to watch it and slow down, I don't know how anybody does that. They think that they don't need to watch the whole thing. They haven't found what they were looking for, but how could you find what you're looking for if you've dismissed what's right in front of you? Instead of waiting for me, right, to get back to him, which I may not have, he now had to wait for that or go somewhere else to find it, the answer to a question that was answered literally right in front of his face. He was already almost at that point where I was ready to answer it. We can't hand you and come over and help you and do this for you. You guys are watching these things. We're trying to help. You got to work with us. If you're not willing to sit through it, I did a 1-minute video and the average view duration was 35 seconds. You people on your end, you have to put some time, energy, and effort into it. That's all I can say. We can't come over there. We can't hand you this information. You have to pay attention, and which means you have to be observant. Usually I find that, I wait for that 1 minute. It could be an hour-long video, and there's usually one or two things that are like the money shot. I'm like, that's why I stayed. Information's not free. Okay? You have to earn it. One way or another, it's not free. You're going to pay in time. You're going to pay in sweat. You're going to pay in blood or frustration out there on a cold day. Hopefully this was helpful to you guys and girls. And you're welcome to come back and check out any one of my other crazy videos over here on Archer's Garage. I got tons of them. And check out these videos on this guy's machine. When they come out, they'll probably be broken into pieces. And also be coming out with a video on like the complete sort of refurb resto on that beautiful green machine that I just did the test on for you. That thing was a mess. It was broken. It was neglected. And again, somebody hating on it because they don't know how to take care of it. They don't know what they have. Good luck trying to replace it today. Something like that will be over $2,000, well over it. And he was getting a little disappointed. He thought for the few $100s that he spent on it, he didn't make any money. It was a bad investment. Nothing could be further than the truth, because he would be spending not a few $100s. He'd be spending thousands of dollars. And you can still have this problem, even with a brand new machine. I'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks for watching Archer's Garage.